Hello everyone, I'm delighted to welcome today Jan Eeckhout, who is the Career Research Professor of Economics at the Pompeu Fabra University in Bostoen. Welcome. Professor Eeckhout's research focuses on the macroeconomic implications of market power as well as its labor market consequences. His work has been incredibly influential in the discipline. In the leading journals in the field, including American Economic Review, Econometrica, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. We're delighted to have you here, and today we'll be discussing his most recent book, The Profit Paradox, exactly how thriving firms threaten the future of work, which was published with the Princeton University Press. And I'm Sonali Chowdhry. I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. I'm a trade economist and I examine superstar firms and their role in trade networks. Joining us is also my colleague, Friso.
Hi, I'm Friso Bostoen. I did my PhD at the University of Leuven, focusing on the market power of online platforms and specifically the ways in which they may abuse that and how that conflicts with competition law. So, Jan, thank you so much for being here. So we read your book with much interest and recommend everyone to do so. But for those who haven't done so yet, could you maybe introduce us a bit, explain us what this profit paradox is and why we should be concerned about its implications?
I mean, the paradox is really, I think, very straightforward. That on the one hand, if you look at the performance of these dominant firms, which is stellar, this is visible in stock market indices, this is visible in profits that they report, so this is amazing. Very often people associate this with a healthy economy, but at the same time we see consequences of these dominant firms that are actually not so good. We see things like wage stagnation, we see startups that are slowing down, that there's fear of them. We see declining business dynamism and a whole number of macroeconomic consequences. And so that's really the paradox. On the one hand, what looks like good news is really not so good news for the economy as a whole. And the reason is not so much that these firms make profits. The reason is that these firms make profits because they face too little competition. Because if it was because they're innovating and then we have a Schumpeterian kind of creative destruction, then these profits are temporary. But by now we know that the profits of Facebook, Google, Amazon have been there for quite a while, and it doesn't look like they're going to disappear very soon. And so yes, we should be concerned. We should be concerned because this is something that has negative consequences. We'll talk more about this in this conversation. But let me leave it here, and we can then pick up on really why we should be concerned.
Great, thank you for that. So at EY, as another academic institution, we're very interested in the process of producing excellent research. So could you maybe share with us some insight as to how you started noticing this problem, how you went about diagnosing it, and then all the way to publishing this book on it?
I mean, it's been a lot of research, a lot of luck, a lot of coincidence. But as always, you have to be caught working when the luck strikes, right? And so we were working hard on hard problems. Let me give you a little detour. This is maybe more for the economists than for the legal scholar. But we were working on a theoretical problem. Okay, and we were working on a theoretical problem, trying to understand how wages are affected by, kind of the absence of competition in some markets. Okay, so it could be, incomplete markets because of market power. It could also be we model all kinds of other things, for example, patent traces and things like that. And so the question is, if you have these imperfections in some market, how does that affect, how firms hire? And we noticed that this was really having a big effect on wages. And so we said, okay, let's now try and think of a way to measure market imperfections, and the obvious one to measure would be market power, because that's where we have the best data, the best way to measure this. As we started to look at this, and that's when I talked first to my co-author Jan Eeckhout, who'd been working on market power for a long time. And so we discussed what we could do, and we basically looked at a long-term trend, which is quite unusual in IO in the industrial organizations literature, because people tend to focus for good reasons on narrowly defined markets, because that's when we have sufficient data to analyze what's going on. But we decided to look on the long-term trends and the whole cross-section of the economy, because we were really interested in the macroeconomic aspect of it. And there we used a different way of measuring market power. We used this, what's called the production function approach. And so that approach has the advantage that you can actually analyze data, you can analyze market power with less data than what you would use with standard IO approaches. This is also an approach in IO, but that has been used to that. And so then we just looked at a really long time series. We went back to the 50s at a cross-section of a large number of firms covering the entire economy. And then we were just, I guess, as flabbergasted as anyone else to see that it was just this very stark rise since the 1980s, which we hadn't noticed, and we believe not many other people had noticed either. And so that was the kind of, the first shock. We were initially trying to say, okay, how is this now going to fit with this theory that we were trying to develop? And the moment we talked to anyone else, they said, oh, forget about this kind of, theory that you're trying to model. Just let's try and get to the depth of what's going on and try and understand more the measurement. And so, just to sum up, there was a lot of luck involved. Anyone else, it wasn't that hard to do what we did. But we were looking for something, that's for sure. Maybe we just found something with some luck.
That was a great insight into how to transform the empirical facts that you observe in data and really extend it into like a full body approach like this book. My first question to you is, in your book you discuss how these new disruptive technologies, they tend to favor the early adopters, and are also one of the reasons why we see this concentration of market power. And in that context, I'm curious whether you see a role for more activist industrial policies in addressing this issue of market power. And this question is basically arising from the discussions we're having in Europe about the use of these industrial policies to promote small and medium enterprises, or to basically catalyze this transition to more sustainable digital futures.
It's interesting that you use the term industrial policy, and I think it's the correct term. But I saw a presentation by Jan Eeckhout recently, and he said, we were not allowed to talk about industrial policy because that was, the thing of the 60s and the 70s. This was an infectious disease. You couldn't touch it, right? So, but yes, that's really what's going on now. What is industrial policy? And I think, when we talk about policy intervention, it has a lot of different names, and sometimes the names are used in interchangeable ways. For example, antitrust is often used for the whole thing, everything that could be ex-ante regulation, could be industrial policy, but could be more narrow, probably legal term, which is, what to do if there is basically some conduct that's not allowed by the law, and that's kind of, but very often, maybe economists more than legal scholars would say antitrust is the whole thing. So let me try as little as possible to focus on terminology, whether we call it industrial policy or not. But I would distinguish between a bunch of actions which are on the ex-ante, and where you basically regulate ex-ante, which we already see now in transportation, in communication, in energy, where there's a lot of heavy regulation. You can't just set up, energy producing plant without being subject to regulation that says, well, this is a natural monopoly. We've realized that, and so given that this is a natural monopoly, there's very strict regulation of what you can do and how electricity is traded, and these are very heavily regulated markets, and this is probably the closest that gets to industrial policy. And so you have this ex-ante regulation, and you have the more exposed kind of antitrust interventions, such as merger review and a whole wide range of aspects that are related to this antitrust. And with the new technologies, we're falling a little bit in between, because on the one hand, we see, of course, that there are enormous returns to scale that are coming from basically the digital technologies, the use of data that are basically close to zero marginal cost products, very big fixed cost upfront investments. And we know, and on top of it now, they're global products in the sense that, the Uber app is being used basically around the world. So you basically have global monopolies. Okay? And even if you go back to the 19th century, say 1900 rather, the kind of the dominance we had were still fairly national. Okay? Now it's really global monopolies. And so, given that you have these enormous, or these massive returns to scale that give rise to natural monopolies, and of course the type of intervention is going to look very much like industrial policy, because you will want to regulate it. I mean, if there's a natural monopoly, there is going to have to be some form of regulation. And the answer is that we definitely, I think, have to do something, because really the markets are not competitive. Then the question is how to do it, which is a lot harder. But it's not just the ex-ante regulation, because I think antitrust has a big role too, and we see it, in my view, and I would like to hear Friso's view on this, the ambiguity of the Digital Markets Act, which we're going to talk about later, which isn't making to me very clear whether this is about antitrust, about ex-ante regulation or industrial policy. And I think there is a little bit of both going on, because the fact that, for example, an Amazon puts its competitors' results in a search on page 7 and its own stuff on that seems like more an antitrust question, which gives them that dominant position anyway. It's a creative, clever way on their end to use the digital technology, to use data, but ultimately it creates a dominant position. And yes, it's coming from the early adopters, because many of these large increasing returns natural monopoly firms are going to be the early adopters. They're going to be the winners who take it all, and I think that's what we've seen.
Yeah, now that we're talking about this, maybe drill down a bit on this Digital Markets Act, if you want to. Because indeed, I agree that they don't call it antitrust regulation, because that would come with its potential issues, but it's certainly antitrust inspired. A lot of these provisions have a precedent, so to say, in ongoing or past investigations. Of course, it's not the classic antitrust approach where you go on a case-by-case basis, but you try to, set out this list of do's and don'ts for these, gatekeepers, the big tech firms that surface often in your book. So I wonder what you think about the approach, because a lot of these do's and don'ts have to do with interoperability, which is something you go into the book as perhaps one of the most promising interventions. It's of course very specific. There's interoperability of app stores, of messenger services. So, the digital economy has many facets, and this is trying to regulate at least the most important choke points. So whether we qualify it as antitrust or ex-ante regulation, which maybe is not the best dichotomy in any case, do you see promise in this approach, or do you think it's too little, it's rather too much and it might stifle innovation? What do you see as
I see a lot of promise. My main concern with the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, is that, I think the legislation as it is fine, but the implementation may lag behind. And the reason is not because the legislation is insufficient or is flawed, or there's always weaknesses in any legislation, but I think it's as good as it can get. The big danger is that there is so much money and interest in not implementing many of these good ideas that it's going to become legally very hard to get anything to be, to get through effectively. The law is there, but ultimately if we don't do it, because there's a lawsuit and one of the big players throws a lot of money at it, the enforcement isn't clear at the moment. Suppose it's the antitrust authorities who have to enforce this. They have very limited resources. One of the things that policymakers tell us is that they want to do this without much additional resources. So this is going to, create a practical problem in getting to the solution. In my view, the way in which it's going to work best is if we're going to have a more of an ex-ante type regulation, industrial policy style approach, rather than an ex-post antitrust judicial kind of approach. And the reason why is because in the ex-ante approach, there's going to be less room for this kind of antagonistic, who's right, and let's now litigate this and let's see who's going to win. And the reason I think why it should be on the ex-ante industrial policy and ex-ante regulation industrial policy approach is that most of the issues are really returns to scale issues, and so there's not much to litigate there. Okay, it's not about the fact that did I take over a firm that I shouldn't have taken over because there were or were not synergies and things like that. It's not really about that. Now, of course, the big players, the interested parties, will argue completely the opposite. They will say, no, but the fact that Apple on its App Store charges 30% for any download of a program, they say, well, this is about us pricing competitively, and they will twist the debate in that direction. But if you ask me, it has a lot of potential if we get the implementation right, and it will also have a lot of bite. And this is something that I'm hopeful for, but also a little bit wary whether this is actually going to happen.
Okay, so promising, but a lot will depend on enforcement. Okay, I have a lot more toxic questions on this, but I don't want to monopolize this conversation, so I'll turn it over to Sonali.
Is it the natural monopoly?
Not yet.
I just want to tag on to what you were saying earlier about the emergence of these global companies that really operate across borders, and how those are the ones that really we need to think about regulation and sort of tackling, addressing the issues of market concentration in those forms. And I was thinking of how the process of globalization has contributed immensely to the emergence of these transnational corporations. And here in the book, we emphasize a lot this empirical pattern that globalization has led to inequality declining between countries, but rising within countries. And at the same time, we're seeing globalization also amplify the scale effects that you mentioned earlier. So here my question is, we're still seeing many countries pursue these deep free trade agreements, so they are establishing these mega regional trade blocs. And these negotiations are in full strength because countries are facing a lot of regulatory uncertainty as well. There are geopolitical factors that play into this. And I'm wondering, what do these trade negotiations, what do these upcoming trade agreements need to address in order to tackle this issue of market power in these transnational corporations, and how countries can coordinate their policy responses through these trade agreements potentially?
It's an interesting question. So first of all, let me say, globalization is really a big driver of what's going on. You've summarized it very well in your question. So globalization, I think of globalization as another form of fast technological change, because globalization happens in part because barriers to trade are being brought down, and then it's a policy response. But it also happens because transportation is cheaper and faster, and information technology has become so much more efficient at long distances. So, this is the same whether this is between two countries that are, on the other side of the globe versus two states or two provinces within the same country. I mean, these things also play an enormous role in a local economy as much as it does in a global economy. But that said, globalization is part and parcel of that. And because also you mentioned that these firms now have a global reach, all these free trade agreements, by lowering these barriers, which were there for policy reasons, are actually kind of, putting this technological change on steroids, if you want. I mean, it just reinforces it. Now, your question about policy is a very interesting one. What can these free trade agreements do to at the same time tackle, the issue of dominance? My first reaction would be, let's not mix it, because it's clear that liberalizing trade, and in particular bringing down trade barriers, has enormously positive effect. We've seen it on unfortunately the other side with Brexit, what kind of costs that trade barriers bring, and we still have to see what the long-run cost is going to be in terms of GDP growth, but it seems that it's already sizable. The numbers I see is 1% of GDP growth over the last 4 years since it was basically voted. So that's sizable, that's enormous. Now, so the reason why I'm saying is let's not kind of mix too many things up. There's these huge benefits from free trade. Now, it's also clear that globalization and free trade then generates the kind of superstar dynamic, and there's quite a bit of work on it. And it's not entirely clear which direction it goes initially, because it could be that on the one hand, what, say, the China shock, as we call it, the competition out of China when it enters in the WTO, well, this is creating competition for local producers, so you expect this to lower prices. But at the same time, what you also tend to see is that once this shock has kind of passed through these markets, these industries, you tend to get bigger concentration, because to be able to be a successful player on a global scene, you need scale. And once you have scale, you have the ability to extract rents because you have a dominant position. And so, I think the jury is still out, but from the results I've seen is that initially you see very strong competitive effects, pro-competitive effects, and in the long run you actually see more dominance, as a result of free trade. But just to, does that mean that we should stop promoting free trade agreements? I mean, and if people are going to say, oh, let's not have free trade because this is going to lead to these dominant firms, let's have free trade and let's look maybe separately at what to do with these dominant firms. And maybe this was not your question, but let me just add it to it, that ultimately, because it's a global problem, this dominant firm problem, we need a global solution. And we have the WTO, and maybe we need to think more carefully or more urgently about some solutions for these global dominant firms, this antitrust, or whether it's industrial policy, or whether it's ex-ante regulation. We should think of this also as a global problem. Just in the same way that we think of intellectual property as a global problem. This is, not everyone participates, and not all countries participate, but now we have intellectual properties that is fairly dominant, at least for the most developed nations. A year and a little bit ago, there was talk of having a 15% profit tax, corporate tax rate. Why? Because we see that as a free riding problem, so we need to coordinate this. And I think tackling successfully this global problem of dominant firms in the digital age is also going to require coordination. I would suggest that we do it separately from the free trade agreements, and then, if you have the people sitting around the table, it's going to be similar people. If this is at the highest level, let's, say, let's go back tomorrow and talk about the other issue.
Great. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll maybe return once more to my hobby course of antitrust. Last time, I promise. The broader regulatory framework that antitrust forms a part of, because as you pointed out, there's different regulations pursuing the same goals in slightly different ways. And especially in Europe, there's always been a collaboration, let's say, between antitrust and more ex-ante approach, especially in sectors such as telecommunications, healthcare, finance. And arguably that has led to fairly good, perhaps better outcomes if we compare to the US. Certainly my mobile phone plan has been cheaper here than in the US. And indeed, some academic works, for example, The Great Reversal by Philippon, or The Antitrust Paradigm by Baker, sort of supports that indeed the stronger regulatory framework in Europe has led to some better outcomes. But you go a bit against that grain and say, if you look at the full picture, we're doing as bad in Europe when it comes to concentration in the markets that results in. So does that sort of mean that maybe this regulation isn't achieving its exact goals, or is it more the fact that we only regulate certain sectors, and at the end of the day, you can't regulate everything, so the end result will be the same? And then what does that say about regulating certain sectors and the US-EU difference? And is there perhaps a risk that we're becoming a bit complacent, thinking that we have done better on that front, while the results may not have been satisfactory?
I mean, first of all, there are clearly differences between, in this case, Europe and the US, what you're suggesting. But let's also not forget that Europe was lagging until well after the Second World War. Europe really didn't have much in terms of antitrust regulation, policy, implementation. The US had started at least 50 years earlier. Okay, so the Sherman Act is the end of the 19th century. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that it's always been like that. The second thing is that Europe is also, or has followed very closely this, let me call it the board doctrine since the 1980s of focusing on harm to the consumer, so basically the consumer surplus as a standard for the decisions with respect to antitrust. And so in that sense, while there's differences, they haven't always been like that, and it's also not so clear that at least the objective isn't that different. But on the other hand, I'm also agreeing with you that Europe does things differently. But maybe the biggest constraint is not so much what the intentions are or what even what the legislation is, but ultimately what the resources are. And I think that the resources are as small in Europe as they are in the US. And I think a lot of, we talked about this earlier, a lot of the success depends on resources that are being used to do that. Why? Because you're basically, at least, in many cases, you have to face an opponent who's using a lot of resources. And my understanding of what happens, for example, in the European Commission with antitrust is that they have to make very tough decisions about which cases to pursue. Okay? And so it's all about the type of resources that they have. But let me now take a step back and then ask, it's not that I argue, Europe is doing as bad as the US despite of this outcome. What we see in the data is that these dominant firms also exist in Europe. There's probably more in the US and in more household names, but if you go in Europe, we also have Booking.com, we also have Inditex, we also have AB InBev. So we have a number of these firms that are also here in Europe. Now, if you look a little bit at what these firms do in terms of their finances, they trade mainly on the stock exchanges in the United States. And so now, what does that mean? Is AB InBev, a Belgian firm, really a European firm? Because it's a global firm. So now the question is, does it matter where the firm is headquartered in Belgium, where it's traded on the stock market, where its CEO has the office, which is New York in this case, or is it really where the customer is? And the customer is in the United States, in Europe, and in the rest of the world. And I think ultimately what matters for antitrust is not so much where the firm is, which is to some extent an arbitrary issue, because even within the United States, how many of the dominant firms are in Alabama? None. So is the US then so different if you're from Alabama compared to being from Luxembourg or from the Netherlands? So, all these firms happen to be concentrated, at least the tech firms, in Silicon Valley, in California. So does that then, make this so different? And more so, many of the Europeans who have a pension fund that's invested in stocks will own some of these firms. So now ownership is spread around the world. And I can buy Google shares or Alphabet shares. And so this basically, in my view, makes the location / ownership aspect kind of subordinate to where the customers are. And ultimately, I've reached here using my app from Google to get to the right place. And if I came in an Uber, I used an Uber app. And maybe if I book my hotel, it might have been through Booking, which is now a Dutch. But it doesn't really matter where the company is, it matters where the customer is. That doesn't mean that the location is irrelevant, because the location is very often in response to policies, in particular, fiscal policy. It's no surprise that many of these companies are in Ireland or are locating in fiscal paradises. But I think that once we recognize that this is a global problem, then the discussion about Europe versus the US versus the rest of the world becomes, in my view, more about, is there an opening for these firms to avoid some of that legislation, and they will respond to weaknesses and the differences in legislation by locating in different places. Suppose that Europe became very strong in its antitrust enforcement, many of these firms might decide to move somewhere else, but Europe will still enforce antitrust legislation because there's customers based in Europe. And so I think ultimately this is going to be what brings us back to this international coordination in terms of the policy response. But maybe you should focus more on this being a global problem rather than thinking, is Europe different than the United States? Although I completely agree, it's an interesting debate as to where do we stand on policy questions. Because one of the things we see is that people seem to like in the antitrust community the Digital Markets Act, and the American policymakers look kind of very careful at the details of that and look in a way, can we do something similar but different for the United States? So I think in that sense these differences are also potential for copying positive developments.
Right, the so-called Brussels effect, where
exactly.
Brussels regulates and serves as an example. Maybe one quick follow-up before I hand it off, because you mentioned the consumer welfare standard, which indeed is dominant in the US as it is in Europe. Perhaps there are some interpretive differences. We might take a slightly broader view at some points. But your book contains a plea for taking consideration of all stakeholders, which perhaps argues for a change to that standard, considering not only consumers but also workers. For example, I think that the general counter-argument is, well, how do you trade off the welfare of one group against the other if there is a conflict, which sometimes might be the case? Do you think that's a fundamental problem, or is it more a question of developing the tools to properly take account of all those interests?
So the trade-off is obviously a fundamental issue in economics, and I think also in the legal profession. But we already do it, right? Because we make a trade-off between the profits and the welfare of the customers. So there is already this tension, and in any policy framework, if there's no trade-off, it's an easy policy, right? And so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. That creates debate, that creates litigation, but at least it's something that's inherent, so we cannot get around it. But I'm not forgetting what you
consumer welfare paradigm and the potential changes that
right. I think the bigger problem is that once we focus on things beyond the consumer, if we stay within the effect of an individual firm on, say, wages, monopsony effects, I think that's already done. It's part of antitrust. It's been part of antitrust for forever. So this has never been out. And maybe it wasn't, there wasn't many cases. It wasn't in vogue, so to speak. But it's not something that's new. What I argue in the book is that there's also some other effects which come from the fact that what we would call general equilibrium effects, that are economy-wide effects. That is, if there's enough firms that have market power, then this has macroeconomic implications. It's not that Google pays its workers badly. In fact, Google pays very well, and many people would like to work for Google. But there is an effect coming from Google, Facebook, Inditex, ABMF, a large chunk of the economy being processed through these dominant firms, and now this affects prices. Okay, we've known that. But if the prices are high, the quantity produced and demanded is lower, so therefore there's less demand for labor to produce the same things than what you would have if there was lower prices. So now lower demand for labor means that wages fall. you cannot attribute this uniquely to Google. Google can be, is big, but is a tiny bit in this big mound of dominant firms. And so now how do we deal with that? And I think legally we have an issue here, and I always compare it to what's going on in climate change and policies to tackle climate change. Is that, I mean, it's clear that CO2 emissions cause illnesses, cause asthma, cause death. But it's not that my car's CO2 is killing my neighbor or is causing, my uncle's asthma. It's the 5 billion cars in the world that cause this. And so now we have to do something about this broad problem if we believe that it would be in the interest of the entire world population to have less CO2 emissions. And that's now just directly from particles, and then we can talk about the impact of higher temperatures and all this. So let's suppose we agree on doing something about it. I cannot go after legally, and here you have one driver. I cannot even go after one, company that sells CO2 emitting fuels. So because they're just doing what they're doing, and this is kind of pure externality. And I think that's, in my view, where the biggest challenge is.
Yeah, so the fundamental problem is that antitrust law is essentially aimed at firm-specific market power, while we're now dealing with economy-wide market power, and we don't have the tool to solve for that.
And can I just kind of hop on this? This may be why we need more of the ex-ante regulation to deal with it, because that's, saying we are per se trying to get more competition. We not only evaluate this on the fact that whether or not this causes harm to the consumers, but rather we want competition per se. And in fact, I was talking to the head of the antitrust authority in the Netherlands a few weeks ago, and he said, nowhere in the Netherlands or in the European Charter does it speak about the consumer standard. In fact, in the Netherlands it talks about we want competition per se, that's our objective. Okay, and I think in a sense, while you can get this, of course, and you need antitrust enforcement to obtain this, you can also obtain this with ex-ante regulation.
Yeah.
Great, fascinating discussion. I particularly was really interested in the kind of systemic risks that you're highlighting from these too big to fail companies that we saw sort of in the aftermath of the financial crisis, that you perhaps can't pin the blame on individual entities, but rather the kind of structure, the economic structure that they create together. So incredible sort of insight on that. I suppose I'd like to sort of shift tracks a bit and tackle this issue that you raised of fiscal paradises that you term in this way, and also the role of location. So we spoke about how countries need to coordinate their efforts to perhaps tax these large corporations, since they have these dispersed production across boundaries, and the fact that taxation has been like a sort of kind of challenging policy pursuit. So here we're seeing in Europe like these proposals for a windfall tax, for example, on energy companies that have made significant profits over the Ukraine crisis. And I'm wondering whether we can take some of this like sort of political will as well as template of these windfall taxes also to consider the issue of market power more generally, and also think of whether such proposals can be useful in addressing this issue of concentration and excessive profits in other sectors. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think, in the grand scheme of things, resources is really like a big entry in having successful policy that leads to competitive markets. I wouldn't call it market power per se. And the reason why I wouldn't call it market power is that I think most people will agree that the market for oil or liquid gas is actually a fairly competitive market. There's a world market for it. No one believes, I think, that the price is too high, maybe because the Saudis, let me take it back. There is a little bit of an issue there with the cartel. But let's say in general, especially in the last decade or two, when there's been so many new producers of fracking in the United States, Norway, there's been so much new supply, which has made this, let me call it, has made this market more competitive. Okay? But there is a hugely different issue when you talk about these windfall gain taxes, is that resources are what they are, and if for whatever reason, war in the Ukraine, or whatever reason, the price of this scarce resource goes up, the firm that owns that well, or the firm that exploits that well, has really no kind of contribution to creating that value. Okay? It's an inelastically supplied good. We know that there, basically in terms of resources, you should only reward the owner and the exploiter of that for what they do in terms of getting this out. And maybe you need a BP to get the oil out of, a deep sea well, because it requires investment, it requires engineering skill, it requires a lot of knowledge. But the resource itself does not need to be part of that reward. You can, do this in many ways. And let's look at, I think, the success story and then the failed story. The success story is Norway. In Norway, since, hydroelectricity that they've had for over 100 years, they basically regulate natural resources in the following way. They say, this is ownership of the government. Even if I pass on this ownership to you, and there are private firms who own oil and gas and hydroelectricity, but they say, if you don't own it, okay, what we do is we're going to tax you at a different rate than if it is owned by the government. Okay? Or we're going to tax you at a different rate, more importantly about it, than if this is a product that is not a natural resource to produce the spend. Okay? And so what happened there is that, they tax it first of all at 78% profits. Okay? So there is still an incentive to do well in terms of, if you are more efficient in getting this resource out of the ground, which is a technological engineering challenge, you get rewarded for that. You get basically an 18, so you average 78, 22% profit rate. But not only do they do that, they also say that if you want a natural resource, since I think it's the beginning of the 20th century, they say not only can you do this as a private company, you're going to set up a new company, you can have 40%, the government has 60%. So then this remaining 22% reduces only to a profit rate that applies to 40% of that. Okay. So what happens now? Well, what we've seen in the last year, a huge rise in these natural resource prices. These companies do a little bit better, but not enormously better. The government, the sovereign wealth fund in Norway is growing like crazy. So it's basically the government that's kind of, reaping in these resources. Do they have to do this last minute and say, we saw the war, 2 months after the war, prices are too high, what do we do? They don't have to do anything, it was all set up like that. The companies, if BP had an oil well, they knew this when they entered into this. They knew that if there would have been a war, that they wouldn't be able to get that whole windfall gain. They would get their little share of it, which is, arguably, is that the right number? Then we can discuss this, but this is with all policy. But at least it's the right policy. Now that's, I think, the successful policy. I suppose we don't have to do anything. If the Norwegian government decides that energy prices are too high for a household, okay, well, they have the sovereign wealth fund. They can basically use this to subsidize prices to their customers, and they can do whatever they want in terms of breaking that link between the ownership or exploitation and the customer. Okay. Let's now go to the failed experiment. Russia in the 1990s with the privatization of all the resources. Basically, and this is not just what happened politically in Russia, this was also in the West through all the, let me call them broadly, the advisors who said we have to privatize this communist economy, and basically the keys were handed over to individuals. If you look at what we now call the oligarchs, they're owners of basically natural resources. They are oil, gas, fertilizer, and then iron ore and all kind of mining products. So basically what you see there is they gave them the 100% instead of the 22% of the profit. Are they going to be better exploited? I haven't seen any study. I would be surprised if it's going to be done better in Russia than it's going to be done in Norway. Okay, because the incentives are very steep there. Okay, so if you do a little bit better, you get actually a better return there. You know, if one of the oligarchs sits down and says, "Well, they're doing well enough. I mean, I sit on my $700 million yacht, and I don't care whether it's done more efficiently." And so what we've seen is, basically this enormous concentration of these resources. Now, I think the rest of the world, with many of its energy companies, is a little bit in between, because some of these firms are not taxed-like in Norway. Okay, they're obviously not owning it in the way that the oligarchs own it, because they very often were public government-owned companies that were made private sometime in the 80s or the 90s. And so you have a little bit of a mix, but I think it's a little bit from the viewpoint of a well-functioning market economy. It's probably not a good idea to improvise and say prices have gone up, let's now tax these windfall gains. Although you would like to do this at this point, but maybe you should put in the system and the mechanism. Exactly, and then see how they respond. So when I started, I said maybe resources, they're all about a well and efficient functioning market economy, but I wouldn't call them necessarily market power, because I wouldn't think that Abramovich has market power. He just is a big owner in a fairly competitive world. I mean, I said I think that oil is competitive. It's not, but it's become more competitive over time.
Right, so I'm starting to see a theme of this talk, setting up the structures and organizations correctly beforehand rather than intervening after the fact. Maybe with that insight, I'll take us to the final question, unless you have any burning questions left to ask. So we're curious as to what are sort of the remaining gaps in our understanding of these superstar firms we've been talking about, and specifically their effects on work in these modern times. I mean, in other words, what are some of the interesting issues that young economists and trust scholars could be working on to help our understanding and hopefully make the world a better place?
Right. I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of open questions. It's one of the things, whenever I look, I see market power and I see problems. But that would be my bias. But I think market power is not new. It's been part of economic writing forever. But what is new is that we're now in an era where two things are different. One is technology has changed, and two, what we see that is happening as a result of this today is very different from what we have seen ever before. And so I think economics has a big challenge, legal studies have a big challenge. I mean, I would say, political sciences has a big challenge, sociology, because, we haven't talked much about the polarization in society, the yellow vest in France. We can talk about all kinds of social conflicts that arise, which are not necessarily just a result of market power, but which are built on a breeding ground that is coming from this kind of increasing inequality. I think the challenges are multiple. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but I would say, in a nutshell, the biggest challenge is, of course, what can we do in terms of policy? What kind of legislation, what kind of economic policies, what kind of social policies, what kind of political institutions can we build in order to tackle this? And I would say, second, really focus on these economy-wide implications that go, in economics speak, through general equilibrium, but in general, there are effects that go way beyond the direct effect of this one firm having market power. This being something that's much more widespread, and therefore having much deeper consequences in the entire economy and in the entire society as a result of that. And I think that's, to me, something that I don't understand it fully. There's a lot of kind of these mechanisms that we don't really understand exactly how they work, how they play on different factors in the economy. And unless we know that, we won't really be able to fully adjust or change policies to tackle it. I think we're one step further. We know that there's a problem. Okay? And we know some things of that problem, but there's so much still going on. And then the other thing is things are changing so fast that, you know, who knows where we will stand within 2 or 5 or 10 years when maybe instead of the big 5 there's only 1 left because they've all merged or they've competed each other away, and then everything is happening through one dominant tech firm. If that's the case, what's going to happen then? And so, given the rapid change, the novelty of it, I see questions and issues everywhere. But at the same time, I also see that we have in all fields a good set of tools to think about it. We have a good set of tools to analyze it, and we should basically use existing tools to try and understand more.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I just want to thank you so much for sharing your insights on this book and for addressing our questions. And just to cap it off, I think this book comes at a really topical moment in time when we have these big questions to address that confront us, and that we can learn a lot from reading the book and sort of also understanding the historical paths that led us to this juncture. So thank you so much.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.